Okay. Hi, everyone. Again, super excited to have Jessica here to talk today about how to become a counseling psychologist. I think some of you might know Jessica already because she's teaching counseling psychology in the third year. And I know at least some students that I see from the participants list who also do that. I think it's amazing to see how many students are already here, even though it's kind of late in the term. It's amazing to see, and I think it speaks to Jessica's appeal, but also to the appeal of the topic. Normally, as per usual, I don't tell anything or much about our guests because the guests often introduce themselves much better than I do and kind of tell a little bit about how they became, in this case, a counseling psychologist and what we can learn from this experience. If you have any questions, there are three ways to do it. You can just raise your hand and ask it directly, which is wonderful. It's great to hear somebody else's voice. Don't feel afraid of that. You can also put it in a chat. I will monitor the chat, and so that Jessica doesn't have to do kind of like multitasking. And then you can also either to everyone in a chat or just to me in a chat, and we will get to all the questions at the end. But if I feel like it's a good thing to do, then I would just interrupt Jessica, and then we ask her a question before she goes on. And I think this morning or this noon when we chatted about this event, we really want to have a conversation with you guys. If you feel like at some point you want to share something, I think Jessica said it before, and when in the beginning, just feel free to share it. Super happy to hear from you, from your experience, and what your interests, concerns, or questions are. Without further ado, Jessica, I would pass the mic virtually over to you. And yes, thank you so much for being here. It's amazing, and I'm quite excited to listen to your presentation.
Great. Well, listen, the excitement is mutual. I always love talking to our BSc students. I particularly love talking about counseling psychology and just sort of the real benefits of considering this as a future career option. So the thanks is all mine, the gratitude is all mine, and the pleasure is all mine. Let me go ahead and just pull up my slides just so that I don't forget to do that. Can everyone see that okay? Right. Okay. So you might notice there is a cup of coffee there because that is my mojo. That's what keeps me going every day during this pandemic. And without that coffee cup, I wouldn't be here today. So that's why it's there, just to kind of symbolize the creation and development that coffee produces for me in my daily life. So I'm Jessica Jones-Nielsen, as Andreas just shared with you. And I'm a counseling psychologist. I'm registered with the HCPC and a chartered member of the British Psychological Society. I also work as a senior lecturer here at the Department of Psychology within the counseling psychology program, as well as the BSc program. And most recently, I was appointed the University Assistant Vice President for Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion. And today I'll be talking about being and becoming a counseling psychologist. So a little different from how to become a counseling psychologist, but really focusing on what it's like to be a counseling psychologist and what are some of the steps you can take to really taking that career choice going forward. But before I get started, I'm just going to share a little bit about me with you, just so that you know where I'm coming from. And also just to say, counseling psychology wasn't always in my future. I'm a child of immigrant parents in the United States. My mother was from El Salvador, which is a Central American country. My father's from a tiny little island called Bermuda, which people get mixed up with Barbados or the Bahamas, but Bermuda, which is also kind of a Commonwealth island. And like every immigrant child, there was always an expectation that maybe I might go to medical school, become a lawyer, or some kind of money-making career. But no, instead of that, I had other plans. I decided to become a psychologist. So there I am in the flesh with my really slick Converse. I don't know if anyone owns those right now, but essentially I was this little girl growing up in California, and I was a first-generation university student. I did my PhD in counseling psychology at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida, and I graduated from that university program in 2010, where I obtained my degree, but also completed my residency in becoming a licensed psychologist in counseling at Duke University. So the training that I took and sort of the degree that I have is quite different from the training and degree attainment here in the UK. But nonetheless, I was able to kind of qualify here in the UK because of the credits, also the type of training that I had, which was both clinical and research focused. So it was quite intense in both research and clinical practice. And then once I graduated from my degree program, I had to complete over 2,000 clinical hours in a psychology residency program, which allowed me to apply for licensure in the United States. However, love had other kind of, I suppose, futures for me. And so therefore, I ended up having to move here to the UK. And that was, gosh, that was back in 2011. And my husband and I both were able to obtain positions at Imperial College London, where I became a research postdoc. And in that research postdoc position, because at that time when I moved here, wasn't able to fully register myself as a counseling psychologist, I worked on a integrated research project for Imperial in order to assess how integrated healthcare practices could influence and improve the treatments in NHS. And so I did that for a couple of years before I had my first child, Elijah. And so, that really started spurring me into thinking about, how I can re-enter into counseling psychology. So I looked at sort of getting myself registered and getting myself in a place where I could also work as an academic psychologist. So I'm not a traditional counseling psychologist here in the UK where I'm practicing full-time. I'm actually a full-time academic where I'm teaching and training future counseling psychologists in the DPsych program. So I've been here at City University since 2013, and also applying my leadership skills that I've developed through my training and other kind of practices in counseling psychology by helping and supporting the university address EDI issues, but more particularly around anti-racist practices and really helping individuals to tackle discrimination, harassment, and bullying of marginalized and racialized groups here in the university. So that's just sort of a quick whistle-stop tour of my background and just letting you know that it's not exactly a linear kind of trajectory, but that really there were so many influences along the way that have really inspired me to really kind of lead in counseling psychology, but why I have such a great passion for teaching and training, but also research in counseling psychology. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I go through the slides, but also I'd like for you to, at any point, stop me if you have any questions, if you want clarifications. This can be a conversation. This is really an opportunity for you to kind of get your head around, is this potentially a career for you? And in fact, I should also add that counseling psychology in the UK was really born, in the US was really born out of vocational psychology. So back when soldiers came back from World War II, there was really a huge adjustment period for Americans to kind of get people back into roles to really support the economy, to get people to adjust back into kind of a civilian life. And so counseling psychology emerged as one of kind of the disciplines that really supported that societal restructuring and supportive services. So therefore, a lot of the work that we have done traditionally and historically as counseling psychologists have been around vocation, helping people to assess, what career paths were best for them, and also really trying to motivate people to find and identify the values that were congruent with the career path. So as always, my emails are always open to any questions about what you want to do with your psychology degree. I'm not only partial to counseling psychology just because I believe all applied psychology helps society in any way possible. So definitely always feel free to email me after this presentation. So today I'm going to talk about what is a counseling psychology psychologists specifically, and also how do we do the type of work that we do. And then for those of you who really want to kind of consider this as a potential route for career progression, what can you do to equip yourself? And I know a couple of you already started asking about volunteering, which is great. And it's great, even if you're in your first year, to start considering these volunteering options for you. And then I will try to end it with kind of some of the training paths that you can consider, and talk a little bit about the training here at City University's Professional Doctorate in Counseling Psychology, which I served as a program director for 3 years in. And then hopefully I can open it up for questions and answers. Okay. So what is counseling psychology? And, I alluded to it as a discipline that really supports society in adjusting and really trying to cope with kind of everyday issues. And basically the principles of counseling psychology are underpinned by both counseling and psychotherapy. And it has roots in the tradition and theory of counseling per se. And I guess a lot of people know about Carl Rogers. Does everyone know about Carl Rogers? So he's sort of the grandfather of counseling, and he's the one who pretty much coined that term for us. And as I said before, there have been a lot of social and historical forces that have shaped counseling and its introduction, both here in the UK and in the US. But as a result, counseling psychologists over time have evolved to really work in different settings, which include schools, hospitals, colleges, prisons, companies, and private practices. So we're pretty much everywhere. We've infiltrated every setting that you can think of. We also work with individuals with mild, moderate, and severe and enduring mental health issues. But mainly our kind of bread and butter is not to kind of diagnose and label people, that we really see kind of everyday experiences with anxiety and depression as normal life occurrences, and really sort of normalizing that and ensuring that people are felt supported in that way. So if we do kind of look at the definition of counseling in itself, it has been used as an umbrella term to cover the range of talking therapies. So some of you might have already been introduced to cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, and then probably more than likely person-centered therapy, which was again, developed by Carl Rogers. And these types of therapies can be delivered by trained practitioners who can work with people in short time and brief limited fashion or long-term in order to make sure that they are able to achieve effective change or to enhance their well-being. So there really is an emphasis on well-being. According to the American Counseling Association, counseling is also a professional relationship that empowers diverse individuals, families, and groups. And essentially it's to help them to achieve sort of mental health, wellness, and education and career goals. So again, there's a huge depth and breadth of where counseling psychologists can fit in society, but also in the settings in which they work, but also the tools that we use in order to support not just the individuals, but groups and systems as well. So I'm not sure if anyone is happy to share, but we're all here in a degree, and I can only assume that you might want to become a psychologist of some type. Does anybody want to just maybe share with me, and you can also write it in the chat if I can find it, what are some of your motivations or reasons for wanting to be a psychologist generally? Anybody like to call it out?
You know me already, both of you.
Yeah, hi Rosalie.
I'll share again. So I am looking to eventually become a counselling psychologist, kind of going through a counselling psychotherapy pathway after I finish my degree. Mostly I've kind of ended up, I'm a mature student, I've ended up on this path, just kind of, it sort of was me, it matches who I am as a person and kind of how I am with other people. So that's why I've ended up wanting to be a counsellor.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing that. Does anyone have any other motivations for psychology that they would like to share? And again, you don't have to call it out. You can write it in the chat, and it could be just one sentence or so. Okay, well, that's fine because I'm prepared and I've come up with some examples that people have already told me. So let's go through them. Okay, so naturally we're curious individuals, and oftentimes it's because we want to find out how people work, what really drives people and what makes them change. It's also about the idea of diagnosis and about how to fix people. And I say that in a way that that really indicates that there are sort of treatments and evidence-based practices that we could use in order to help cure people with certain mental health issues. Also, for those of you who might be interested in sort of the research side of psychology, there is that research imperative in order to really improve our understanding of the world around us, and using concepts that will drive better interventions and better treatments. So again, really in efforts to save people's lives. But even like what Rosalie said, that there are personal motivating factors that really make us want to consider a career in psychology. And one of them, of course, is, earning lots of money, but also helping people at the same time. And, I wouldn't be foolish to not mention that, because, at the end of the day, we do invest in our training. We do invest in kind of going into doctoral training in order to increase our earning potential and also kind of, have a better life in that way. But also, if you can get the reward of helping other people, that's, two ducks or two birds with one stone kind of situation for us. So for those of you who might want to consider becoming a counseling psychologist, again, it's around sort of because you might want to help people. There's that altruistic sense of really wanting to provide support to others. Perhaps maybe as a family member or a friend, you've always been considered as the shoulder to lean on, or the listening ear. But also there's always a sense about giving back to the world and really providing, being a part of a societal fabric that really helps to enrich the human world experience, as well as perhaps you will find that as the most satisfying job prospect, considering other kind of options that you might be thinking about, like accounting or engineering. Less sexy. Also, perhaps maybe personally you've had therapy, you've experienced therapy, and that experience for you was positive, and you really want to be able to give back what you received. And so there's always that kind of reciprocal nature of wanting to become a counseling psychologist. So all of these different types of reasons might drive you to consider this profession in the future. And I'll keep on going a little bit. So for those of you who are not too sure about how counseling actually helps and kind of what we do as counseling psychologists and how we work, we really try to kind of promote insight and the ability for others to relate to each other. And so really a lot of the basic principles of how we sort of situate ourselves in individual, group, and systemic working is about encouraging relational depth and relating to others so that they can relate to those outside of the counseling, or the clinical encounter. There's also a focus on self-awareness and increasing self-acceptance of people's circumstances. Some of you might have already learned about Maslow's hierarchy, where we talk about sort of the basic primal needs of individuals, but as you build upon those needs and sort of that hierarchy, then you reach a level of self-actualization and individuation. There's other aspects of counseling that we also focus on, such as enlightenment and problem solving. Again, going back to kind of cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, which is, one of the cornerstones of the types of therapeutic models that we use. We might address cognitive change, behavioral change, and then working with systems and society, families. We might focus on systemic change and empowerment-based approaches that really help to shift, inequalities and shift kind of marginalizations of particularly vulnerable groups. And then again, it's about really restoring and helping to achieve social action by empowering those that we encounter by using our training and our practice and our leadership skills that we develop within our discipline. There we go. Oh, sorry. So the description of counseling psychology can, be stated by the British Psychological Society as its intention to work with clients to examine mental health issues and explore them, and explore what really drives these underlying problems. And then also we might deal with a major range of, or a wide range of problems that not only concern sort of you know, very significant mental health issues, but also everyday life occurrences, dealing with bereavement and domestic violence and sexual abuse, traumas and relationship issues. These are all kind of issues that as a counseling psychologist, we do encounter on our day-to-day practice. We do understand diagnosis, and we can work within medical systems, working with psychiatrists and other clinical psychologists and medical-based professionals. But we also might look at the unique subjective psychological experiences of our patients and clients, as well as kind of the systems in order to empower recovery and alleviate distress. And this is pretty much the positioning of the Division of Counseling Psychology of the BPS. I'm aware that a number of you have already probably heard about clinical psychology, have probably considered clinical psychology as a potential career path for you. And really what I want to do is to kind of give you the reasons that clinical and counseling psychology can be looked at as similar sort of disciplines, but also maybe just highlight some of the differences just so that you're a bit more informed. So if you did listen to, I think her name was Amanda, she probably would have already described to you the scientist practitioner model, which really underpins the training and also the practice of most clinical and counseling psychologists here who practice in the UK or who research and train in the UK. And essentially, really, it's about being able to be proficient in both clinical practicing or research delivery. And essentially, we allow the research to inform our practice and our practice to inform our research. And as a result, we do tend to use evidence-based therapeutic models. Again, the client groups between both counseling and clinical psychology are quite similar in the sense that we might see clients in medical settings, we might see them in community or school-based settings, and the competencies that we learn or acquire over the time of our training and throughout kind of our experience as practitioners are quite similar in the sense that we both are registered with the HCPC, which is the Health and Care Professional Council. And essentially the standards and expectations of our practice are quite similar in that way. And then with regards to therapeutic approaches, although clinical psychologists historically have been born out of medical settings and worked quite closely with psychiatrists, their CBT approaches have predominantly have been sort of the approach that most trainees are trained in. But then also what we've seen is that there's been kind of a resurgence of systemic therapies as well as other kind of integrative therapies, and that's very similar to counseling psychologists as well. So these are the similarities between the two disciplines. However, although that both of these disciplines are quite similar, it's really about the way in how we actually conduct counseling and psychological therapy. And the differences between us might be really focused on sort of the stress levels that our clients or patients might present with. And so clinical psychology might take more of a view of kind of more abnormal psychology, whereas we look at normative psychological states. And also as counseling psychologists, we tend to be reflective practitioners and really hold that at sort of the central ethos of the work that we do, being able to think about sort of our contributions to our understanding of the human condition within our therapeutic practice, also reflexive in the research that we do. But many clinical psychologists will also think and practice in this similar way. So as time goes on, really, and I think also the British Psychological Society is starting to think about merging a lot of these applied psychologists to make one training degree that is applied and that covers all of these kind of sub-disciplines of applied psychology.
Jessica, could I just ask a quick question? I think one question that, or I was not thinking about it, but last time I talked to a counseling psychology, she told me, psychologist, sorry, she told me that basically a lot of the jobs right now that are advertised for counseling psychologists are also, it's basically jobs within the NHS are often now advertised for clinical or counseling psychologists. So there seems to be, and I think that I just wanted to kind of say that there's basically, if you, there's more and more an overlap. I think if you referenced Amanda, right? And she basically said like, oh, I started CBT and now I feel a little bit frustrated with that and branching out and kind of coming closer to like approaches that you are doing. I think a lot of like traditional cognitive behavioral therapists feel sometimes frustrated by the limits of this approach, or maybe not. I don't know. That's at least my impression from what I'm talking about. Just to kind of highlight that it's often in practice. So if for instance, I always think like, okay, counseling psychology is a little bit more idiosyncratic, taking the person as an individual and looking at that person. Mm-hmm. And clinical psychology is a little bit more normothetic. It's like, oh, we put you in a category and then we apply a certain, but then if we talk to a clinical psychologist, they would probably be mad about this description. It's like, oh, we take people as individuals too. I think there's a little bit, but why I'm saying this is just, there's a different emphasis on these things. It's not so much that there's like, they don't do that, but there's a stronger emphasis, right? Is that kind of...
So yeah, as I was alluding to, I mean, it's context specific. It's also kind of the imperative or the mission of the service that, you know, a counseling or a psychologist, clinical psychologist might operate under. So essentially, you know, I think sort of trying to dichotomize the differences between a counseling and clinical psychology really is going to run into a lot of tension, in the sense that a lot of the core values that both operate under a clinical and counseling psychology overlap. I mean, again, it's really about, you know, addressing and supporting those with kind of lived experiences that might create troubles for kind of their home life, their occupational life, and assisting them with kind of interventions in order to support their ability to adjust to that, or to kind of develop coping skills in order for them to improve kind of their everyday outcomes. And so in that way, that's why, you know, obviously it wasn't the scope of this talk today, but there are kind of historical identity tensions between clinical and counseling. And it's not just here in the UK, but it's definitely, we even have lots of research and writings about kind of this tension between clinical and counseling psychologists and who operates where, because there's always been sort of a kind of a competitive sense of trying to get the jobs in medical settings versus kind of in community or school settings, and one kind of subspecialty kind of operating and having territorial reign over it. But I think, you know, we're on both sides of the pond. I think we've all kind of agreed that we're both doing, you know, the right thing for society, and that there needs to be more of us than less of us. So if we come together and combine forces, then it can only be good. But one of the things, or one of the areas that I also wanted to kind of maybe highlight that counseling specifically focuses on versus clinical psychology is our goal and value of social justice, and being part of the social fabric in order to really empower and to support communities, support families in order to obtain equity and equality. And so that really has been one of the main reasons that drew me to this particular discipline, why I decided to become a counseling psychologist, because at one moment I did think I wanted to work in clinical psychology. A lot of my research as an undergraduate, I remembered, was in health inequalities. And I was always interested, you know, why was there such a disparity in kind of health outcomes of ethnic minority groups like African Americans, Hispanic Latinos living in the United States compared to their white counterparts. And so that research kind of interest of mine really started making me think about, well, what kind of program or what kind of training would allow me to really answer that question and really get to the root causes of that. And, you know, I also considered, you know, medical training, becoming a doctor themselves, like, well, what's the best way to do that is to be a doctor and tell everybody, prescribe everybody the right thing. But I also realized in my undergraduate research experience that doctors didn't quite have it right, and that, you know, there were issues with doctors' training and the way that even medical systems are set up that really perpetuate some of these health inequalities and really exacerbate sort of poor health outcomes for certain ethnic and marginalized community members than others. So when I came across counseling psychology, when I started working with Professor Carolyn Tucker, who is a professor of counseling psychology in the United States, you know, I started to quickly learn that counseling psychology is not just about sort of seeing the person bringing in a problem, but it was really about seeing the person as a whole, and not just about one facet of their identity, but all their identities, and how they can bring that that sense of kind of full inclusion into the therapeutic room, but more so, it's also the research kind of methods that really, that sparked a lot of interest in counseling psychology for me, about really kind of taking a more pluralistic, holistic approach to research that not only draws from kind of like survey, quantitative research design and methodology, but also the lived experiences of those who actually are part of this system that, you know, oppresses them or really kind of keeps them in particular positions in the hierarchy.
Yeah,
so for that reason is why I got, yeah.
Sorry, it's kind of funny in some ways because you basically it almost feels like clinical psychology is catching up to social justice in some way too, because I think we had like 3 talks centered around clinical psychologists, right? From Amanda, we had a talk about BAME clinicians, right? And there's like, I think a lot of clinicians and clinical psychology recognizes in the UK now, we can't just ignore diversity and marginalized group and sexuality and all of these things because they play a key role in the development and the sustainment of this. So I think it's almost like funny in some ways because it's another thing where they kind of catch up. The one thing, I got some questions that I think one thing you will talk about is the differences also a little bit in a kind of how you become one, right? There's just like one of the clinical psychologists. Because some of the questions that I got kind of centered around is that clinical psychology in the UK was basically from the NHS, funded by the NHS to help people within hospitals who have mental health needs. Okay. So if you go into clinical psychology, then this is the main aim, because I think so becoming a therapist in some sense, I think I might be wrong, but I think it's not a protected term in the UK. You and I, we could basically become like OPMA, but it's like as a clinical psychologist, you're basically for acute people in acute crisis, right? That's kind of like the traditional approach. And that's why, so it's not so much about, because I got some question about this, working in prisons or working outside of hospitals or working within communities. That's not the focus of clinical psychology. If you're interested in that, then you should consider counseling psychology because it's much more flexible, and it also allows you more to kind of decide, like put emphasis on things you're interested in. Whereas in clinical psychology, you do a cookie cutter recipe and I don't know, I don't want to, it's a great
Andreas, don't say stuff like that. You're going to upset clinical psychologists.
No. But it's just like, I think it's great, but it's like if you basically do the same things because they need somebody to take care of these specific needs within the NHS. That is your education. And I think that's sometimes when you talk about clinical psychologists, they're a little bit frustrated because they see things you just mentioned about social justice and how this impacts therapy. Things about looking at a holistic person and feel that CBT might not be perfectly suited. Other things, CBT is very, very well suited. Just to kind of pick up a little bit of the questions I got. Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, no, that's perfect. And that's really a great way to kind of integrate that understanding from previous talks, which, I mean, I think, you know, you can see there's a bit of overlap, or at least how certain specialties are sort of answering kind of wider issues in supporting society. So, I mean, absolutely.
On that front, if that's okay. In your opinion, with the pandemic, given that it's going to have it is having and has had such an impact on mental health across the entire world, do you think that could, because right now, of course, counselling psychologists don't get the funding in the same way that clinical psychologists do you think that there is going to be a shift in that, and there will be maybe funding that comes around for people to pursue a doctorate in counselling psychology?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that kind of discussion and that thinking has already started prior to the pandemic happening. And again, it's, you know, I think in our last lectures, we were talking about that there was already a mental health crisis prior to the pandemic. And really, I think, you know, if anything, the pandemic is really, if we think of a metaphor, you know, sort of, you know, putting gasoline onto the fire. I mean, you know, we're just kind of waiting for the perfect storm to even really brew up a real major surge and kind of crisis across the globe, actually. So I'm pretty sure, I mean, I haven't heard anything, you know, as of any sort of update on that, but definitely that was the direction of travel. We saw that, clinical psychology, their funding has been renewed. And in fact, I think they even got more bursaries so that they can actually create more clinical psychology training positions. And I think, counseling psychology training might follow suit. So particularly trying to get more people to really address sort of the surge in mental health crisis that we're already feeling, but we're definitely going to feel the impact quite shortly. So absolutely, great question. So again, it's just, I hope I can leave with you the impression that, we are not just sort of bounded by sort of, working with people on an individual basis, that we do sort of see ourselves as kind of social agents for growth and change, and that, we do aspire to kind of help, I suppose, transform communities and systems, either through leadership, through training, and through research and practice, in order to really deliver, provisions that are going to be culturally responsive, culturally sensitive to the needs of a diverse population that we see kind of growing, particularly here in London. So again, it's about active advocacy on behalf of the needs of those in certain client groups and or with individual clients on specific organizational contexts. So I like to kind of refer to our discipline as like, jack of all trades, master of none. We can be everything whenever you need us to be. So that's always the appeal. And as you can see, I have multiple hats, not just as, a clinician, but also as a researcher, as a, a leader, a university leadership member. And that's because of all the skills that I've acquired as a counseling psychologist over my years of training and practice. So how do we become a counseling psychologist? And you started alluding to it, Andreas, so thank you for kind of opening it up and allowing me the segue. But it is one of the most regulated and recognized counseling qualifications in the UK. So you can call yourself a counselor, a psychotherapist, and anyone can actually do that. Because it's not regulated, but a counseling psychologist is a protected psychological title by the HCPC. So let me go ahead and just get you into my little map. So all of you are here on the BSc, which is an accredited BPS degree that you will be awarded once you graduate from City University of London. And upon kind of your graduation, you would have your graduate basis for chartership membership. I'll make my slides available because a lot of these are hyperlinks where it will allow you to go straight into it and just to make sure that you have everything that you need in order to register yourself for your membership, especially if you're in your first year. And then you're expected to kind of have like a year of foundations training or therapy skills, or that you've accumulated at least 1 year's of comprehensive work experience portfolio. And I'll give you some examples of what those types of work experiences might be. But what I would like to urge you and consider is, if you haven't already started your work experience kind of log, that you keep a log of all your work experiences to really sort of think about and reflect on those experiences at a later time, so that when you are coming to the point of applying for different training programs, whether you go into counseling or clinical or whatever it is that you feel most compelled to do, that you can always look back and see how those experiences have shaped your understanding of the psychological field that you're most interested in, but also how you have grown from it or how you have developed as a result of that volunteer experience. So I'm not sure if there's some kind of log that you're required to keep in your degree course, but that is something I would suggest you do whilst you're training, whilst you're studying for your BSc in psychology. And so once you've kind of acquired sort of at least a year's worth of comprehensive work experience, either you might be interested in a doctorate in counseling psychology or clinical psychology. You would embark probably on a 3-year course. And I say that because a lot of the courses are delivered part-time as well. And, oftentimes people come into doctoral training programs later in their life. So they might be mature students and have kind of other commitments or care commitments to consider. So most of their programs do offer part-time training. And once you've completed, you'll go on to be registered and recognized by the HCPC, as well as get full recognition of the BPS. So this is just a map for you to kind of get that into your mind, and then I'll go more now into specifics. Oops. All right. So here we are. Does anybody miss seeing this? I mean, some of you haven't even seen it. Is that right? I have probably some people on this call who've just never seen. This is the main campus building. This is college building. My office was just across from there. But here at City University of London, in our counseling psychology training, we do offer a Doctorate of Counseling Psychology, or also known as the DPsych. So that would be sort of the classification of your degree once you've qualified. It's, as I said, it's a program that is offered here at City, and we seek to train people in CBT, psychodynamic and person-centered models. And I'll speak specifically about those in the next slide, if I can move over. As I said here, we are a 3-year full-time professional doctorate program, which is approved by the HCPC as well as accredited by the BPS. Unfortunately, we're one of the few programs that only offer full-time training course, and we don't offer part-time. So unfortunately, that won't work for some people who kind of need more flexibility in the training that they need. But it is one of the first courses that have been accredited by the BPS in 1995. And I think we have remained a pretty strong and competitive training program for the last, 10 years or so. And, definitely, I think we've definitely developed some robust clinicians and researchers who I've been inviting into my Introduction into Counseling Psychology module over the last 8 weeks. So I am definitely proud of everyone who's come through our training program, and they have been phenomenal contributors to services across the UK and abroad in their respective countries where they've taken their practice to.
Jessica,
yeah.
One question is it recognized worldwide? I don't think so, but I think.
No, I wish. I mean, I wish we, different strokes for different folks. Because it was quite easy for me to get recognized here from my training in the US, which is kind of interesting. But then if I were to have obtained a degree here in the UK from this training program, it wouldn't be recognized in the US. And in some parts of Europe, in certain countries, yes, it is accepted. But then in other countries, no, it's not. And you would either have to sort of do a conversion training program prior to kind of further registration into that. But, it would be great if we had sort of a universal training scheme so that people can sort of train and practice wherever they could.
Okay.
But no, great question.
Yes, I think in Germany it's not recognized either. So I think I think Britain is more happy to take people in who are highly trained and kind of accept them, because it's basically like highly qualified people for free, which is great. Other countries are more protective. They feel like we have already so many, we don't want more. So it's very different.
Well, Andreas, in Germany, it's like you guys created also psychotherapy. Like with Freud and all of them. Like it's every single German person who's been a counselor.
We're all counselors. Yes, that's what we're famous for. Our humor and our emotional qualities. Yes.
I know. A lot of self-reflection there.
I think just to the other question, masters, you don't need a master's to become a counseling psychologist. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yes. That is correct. Okay, and I'll get into sort of the requirements of the degree in a couple of slides so that you'll have that right there, and I can emphasize sort of the major ones. So as I said, once you are, so once you apply, once you have been given sort of your conditional or unconditional approval to start the training as a counseling psychologist, in your first year, you will learn about the main theoretical paradigms of therapy, which included person-centered, cognitive behavioral therapy, and psychodynamics. So that lays the foundation for the three most kind of fundamental approaches in counseling. And then trainees will have to specialize in at least one of these approaches, and that is shaped by the clinical placements that you go on, the supervision that you receive, and then the case studies that you write. So all of this will be kind of competence-based, meaning that you would have to really kind of indicate and demonstrate your skills, your understanding and competence in a range of sort of critical written pieces, as well as demonstrating it in therapy sessions with your supervisor. Trainees are always encouraged to develop an integrative model of their practice because, again, it's really about being agile and flexible and being able to serve the needs of society or the particular kind of contexts in which you are serving in. So we do specialize in kind of integrative psychological approaches in your third year. And then when the trainees leave, they're able to reflect and become ethically sound and competent practitioners with the ability to really evaluate their work and to provide the best and most competent therapeutic and non-therapeutic interventions in various contexts. As I said before, we are scientist practitioners, and particularly at City, we definitely honor the kind of the model of scientist practitioner by ensuring that our trainees are robust enough to carry out research activity. I mean, given the fact that we're in a pretty research active psychology department, we definitely have to keep our skills up. But essentially what it is that we want to be sort of outward facing in our research applications, that it's evidence-based, but also that we are always delivering and developing the practice-based and evidence-based knowledge. So therefore we're training our trainees that way. We're also ensuring that they understand a range of psychological research methodologies, which include qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods approaches, and that they're able to write up their research projects in their thesis portfolio. Again, which is sort of a dissertation, well, we call it a dissertation, but I think it's called a thesis here in the UK. So again, that would make an original contribution to the field. Okay, and so what you're expected to do during the degree, and this is the minimum for every single doctorate in counseling psychology degree, is to complete a minimum of 450 clinical hours that are supervised by a registered counseling or clinical psychologist over 3 years. And so in the first year, you would have to do 100 hours. In the second year, you would have to do 150, and then in the third, 200 hours. You're also expected to undertake a minimum of 40 hours of personal therapy. So again, it's about kind of being reflective and being able to really engage that experiential practice in order to be a better clinician and be able to kind of utilize that experience to really show sort of where your limitations or gaps in knowledge and skill might be. And at the end of the program, you would have to submit, as I said, a 400 to 450,000 word portfolio showing sort of the expertise and skills and knowledge set that you've acquired over your 3 years. And that is submitted as a piece that is examined by an external examiner and an internal examiner at the end of your 3 years. And in order for you to pass and gain qualification, you have to pass all of your modules within the professional doctorate. Okay, so once all of this is done, you successfully, leapt through the hurdles, that you were able to, manage the 450 clinical hours without losing, your mind yourself. You would become a chartered member of the Counseling Psychologist BPS division of counseling psychology, as well as, and most importantly, a registered practitioner psychologist with HCPC. And again, then that will give you carte blanche to work in any range of settings that really appeal to you based on your experiences as a trainee, and also influences that you might have with your mentors and supervisors.
Jess, could you okay, that's great. Could you just say one thing about kind of like job prospects? I always say, like, once you're a chartered psychologist, I think you don't have to be worry about being unemployed or worry about anything.
So I mean, our statistics for our professional doctorate is online, and pretty much I think 98% of our trainees who qualify from our degree program are offered jobs on the outset of their qualification. I think if I remember that, it's 98%. And generally, if they're not, and because the numbers are not always 100% accurate, it's because they've chosen to kind of do something else in the sense of perhaps maybe going back and just kind of being with family, or just taking that time off to really sort of recuperate from an intense 3-year practice training practice.
Yeah, so if you want to work, you will have work. If you
no, there is no limitation to the job market. And in fact, it's quite competitive because there's just a lot of need for it. I think something that I should say that I'm quite proud of our training degree program and the preparation of those who qualify from our training program is that we tend to place our students in band 7 and band 8 NHS level clinical roles, which again is quite a feat to accomplish just coming out of qualification that early. So a lot of our trainees from our program definitely are sought after and also kind of hit sort of the ground running on the outside of the qualification.
Okay, could I don't know if you talk about this. Do you talk a little later in the talk, or you're planning to talk about this, about kind of like differences between programs where you kind of?
No, I didn't plan on it. I mean, all I can do is just encourage you. So what I did do, let me see. Here we are, finally. For a list of all accredited counseling psychology training programs, I have this website here, which breaks down every single program offered in the UK. And it basically, what you would do is just look at sort of kind of the model of training and kind of its emphasis. So for example, UEL has a social justice kind of emphasis in its training program. Regent has an existential humanistic emphasis in its training program. City, like I said, we really try to create general practitioners with integrative emphasis. And then the rest, again, sort of based on where they're at with their reaccreditation, I can't really say because, either they haven't been reaccredited or they're kind of doing a huge overhaul on their training program because of accreditation. But the 4 that I just mentioned are the main ones that everyone tends to apply to.
Yeah, so I think, that's very helpful just for the students. I think there's kind of, I would think about it, it's like there's a little bit like almost like a philosophical emphasis that differs between programs. A little bit like, is it methodologically, are all programs more leaning towards qualitative over quantitative, or are differences there too?
No, so all of the programs that are accredited by the BPS have to have sort of a standard of kind of competencies that they show. So more or less, most of the training programs are the same, will have similar emphasis. There's just every once in a while, there might be sort of a special emphasis on a particular approach. But every core standard of training for every single counseling psychology doctoral program will have a similar structure of training program delivery. So it won't vary too much. There would just be certain specialty emphasis.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's okay. That's great to know. And then the other thing I always I just learned, and I don't know if you're allowed to talk about these things or not, but it's like, I think there are some variations in how much you have to pay. I don't know if you're right. There's some.
Yep.
The other thing is, which would be great, I think I got some questions about that, is placements, right? You do these placements. And I think one thing why I think our city, the one is so good, is because you have people dedicated to helping your students finding placements, and these placements are often paid. Is that correct? Right?
Not often paid. It's free labor. It's free labor. I'm sorry.
Okay. So whoever asked me that, I said, I think they're paid. So that was wrong, just to kind of...
Not wrong entirely, but there are psychological assistant posts, which are quite competitive to get, and those are paid positions most of the time. But most volunteer or not volunteer, but most placement posts are you're an honorary kind of psychologist, so you're not paid.
Yeah, but I think that's something to look out for when you don't choose your program, right? Are they good at
Yeah.
helping you to find your placements? Because you don't want to be like how
Yeah.
much support you get for that. Okay, maybe I got some other questions. Maybe you had the Q&A. Maybe you want to say something about kind of eligibility. I kind of cut you out there. Maybe you
Yeah.
can tell us, like, if you select the students for, yes, like what are you looking for beyond, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, like I said, if well, all of you are fine because you will receive your your GBC, and also you will have kind of sort of the foundations that programs like the DPsych here in the UK are looking for. So there's a number of BSc students who have gone on from the BSc, perhaps maybe with like a small break in between, who have come on to the doctorate in counseling psychology. Also remember there's a 10% discount. I hope that's still kind of in place for those of you who continue your education at City. That we would typically look for someone with a 2-1 honors degree or above, and as well as those who have acquired therapeutic skills training, whether it's through kind of a certificate level counseling skills training course, or through kind of experience through your volunteer. We also would want for you to have like specific mental health face-to-face experiences. And again, the requirement says 1 year. But then there are times where we can sort of weigh that depending on something else sort of being the equivalent. If you were, doing working with like a research lab that looked at sort of clinical delivery of a particular population, we could also count that as part of your mental health experience. And then also your ability to undertake a research degree at a doctoral level, and then, engaging with an original piece of research. So these are all the things that you would have to demonstrate or at least have in mind with regards to your application to the counseling psychology program.
Great. Could you, two questions. Could you say one thing about certificate level counseling skills? I got some question about that. Like, is that a training course? I think City has one, but there are others.
Yep. So there's a training.
Not a propaganda thing. We're doing
yeah, again. And so, so there is a training skills course that City does offer, and it's a 4-hour skills course. And essentially, once you have gone on the skills course training program, you receive a certificate, and you would just have to show that certificate as evidence of the completion of that program. And sorry, what was the second thing?
The second thing I wanted to, like, how competitive is it? Because I think like that's a little bit like with clinical psychology, it's often at the end, I was like, oh, here are the numbers, 10%, 15% of the people apply.
So I unfortunately, I do not have those numbers to hand, but I can only tell you from sort of, being on the selection committee side, that it is a highly competitive recruitment process, in the sense of, or application process, in the sense that, we do get, over 300 applications a year on average. And, before, when I first started working at City, I think we would accept up to 40 students a year. But then most recently, because of SSR, which is student to staff ratio, and again, I think this applies to the BSc as well, that we had to significantly reduce the number of students that we allow, or at least who are allowed to enroll into the program, because we do have to maintain that SSR in order to keep our accreditation. So at the moment, we look between 20 to 30 students per year, but really, in the mid-range therein, because of this SSR kind of requirement that we have to maintain.
Okay, great. That's great to know. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I did get a message about sort of financing and funding, and unfortunately, and as Rosalie brought up, that, unlike the clinical psychology training programs, professional doctorates in counseling psychology are not funded kind of like by the NHS. Students do have to self-fund this particular training, which I think, really disadvantages sort of the ability to diversify the workforce of counseling psychologists. But again, as I said, that, there is some movement to see if there could be funding for counseling psychology trainings in the future, again, to address sort of the lack of diversity within the workforce.
So I think, is it correct? I think it's like roughly 30 to 50,000 you have to kind of budget for the 3 years. Is that somewhere?
Yeah, so each degree program or each training program across the UK varies in their fees, but really I think the range is between no less than 9,000 all the way up to 11 to 12,000 per year.
Okay.
Just to add into that as well, there is a government doctoral loan that you can get, which is, I think it's about 10,000 first year, 11,000 second, 11,000 third. Fingers crossed that even goes up over time, but there is a doctoral loan that people can get that will help as well, in case people don't know about it.
Oh, that's great. That's great. But again, oh, you know, I just hope it doesn't turn into the US and then people accrue all of this like educational loan and you're paying it off into like your 50s. So hopefully, I don't know, as long as the interest rates don't change and things like that, then yeah, that's great. But again, we want free training, we want free funding and our free training in the sense of the funding that would be provided by the government.
All right, great.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe you just
got lost there for a second. So I just wanted to be able to provide you some resources because I was very much focused on becoming a counseling psychologist, but also there are routes to becoming a counselor as well as a psychotherapist, which I have provided here in case you're interested in. What I will note as differences between these pathways for, becoming a professional therapist or a counselor is the fact that in counseling psychologists, we do emphasize that scientist practitioner model of training and practice. So therefore, there's that research emphasis that really isn't required to become a psychoanalyst or counselor or psychotherapist. So these are careers and how to become websites for you to look at. Also, to become a psychologist full stop in counseling or clinical is the website just below the How to Become a Counseling Psychologist by Elaine Casket, who's been highly involved in training in counseling psychology for a number of years. So I leave that with you. There are also some voluntary work websites that I just wanted to bring to your attention if you haven't already obtained a volunteer work experience, but these are some of the volunteer experiences that we see a lot of our trainees develop some really critical skills, some very positive skills with regards to preparing them for a doctorate in counseling psychology. So if you go to Volunteer in England, that will provide you sort of really useful kind of landscape of all volunteer experiences nearby. But there's also Do It, the Community Service Volunteers, and Time Bank. And again, you can look at that for general kind of volunteer experiences, or also go into Guardian's Job Volunteering to see if any of them are there as well. But specific ones that we tend to get lots of applications from, or as far as our applicants are concerned, who have showed or demonstrated really kind of robust understanding and really, reflective kind of skill sets that were acquired through their volunteering is like Shout, Samaritans, Sane, The Listening Place, Victim Support, Cruise Bereavement Center, Childline, Place to Be, and Bernardo's. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the examples of those who have come on to this, the professional doctorate in counseling psychology, and who have really been able to kind of get some real positive volunteer experiences that they were able to apply to their counseling psychology training.
That's great. There's a lot of places we mentioned in previous talks already. So it seems it's great to see kind of like an overlap of what the people recommend. It's good to
Oh, excellent.
That's
excellent.
Fantastic. Okay.
So I think that really brings us to some questions, and I realize the time. How did that happen, Andreas?
I don't know. One thing I wanted to say, as always, we like, oh, we do 30 minutes and then somehow we're it takes much longer. One thing I want to highlight, which I think it's really cool about counseling psychology, is that if you're on a counseling psychology program, maybe you can correct me, right? I'm kind of like a lay person knowing everything just from listening to other people talk about it. You have much more freedom in designing basically your own experience throughout the doctorate than you would have when you're in clinical psychology, right? In clinical psychology, you basically you have 3 months, you're on a ward for elderly, and then you have to work 3 months with children, and then you have to 3 months kind of like cancer support.
Yeah.
Could, as a counseling psychologist, say like, I'm really interested in working primarily with and then you can kind of design that. It also means with freedom comes more responsibility, right? There's this kind of trade-off. You might feel like, I just want to be basically in a program that does everything for me. With counseling, you have a little bit more freedom, but it also becomes with a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot of onus on your time management and your sort of organizational skills. And so that's also something that we do try to pick up in the interviews, as far as trying to ascertain the candidate's readiness for taking on that type of responsibility, because that is quite critical. So yeah, you're absolutely right with regard to training as a clinical psychologist, that it's quite standard, and there is sort of these thresholds that have to be met at particular milestones of the training journey in becoming a clinical psychologist. Whereas, counseling psychologists, as you described, really have a lot more flexibility in the sense of kind of carving out their own kind of specialty. And so, for a number of our, like, for example, one of my clinical trainees who recently has graduated, her main focus has been on eating disorders. So from the year one, she has been placed in a clinical eating disorders placement where she practiced in a particular approach, but then over time, she started incorporating different approaches in working with those with eating disorders. And so therefore, and her research was on the experiences of mothers raising children with eating disorders, and really how that has really placed her as a specialist in eating disorders treatment and research. And again, being able to allow her to qualify at a higher band when she was seeking a position in the NHS. So in that way, it allows for individuals to become quite expert in a particular discipline or an area of treatment and practice. But then, if you're not quite clear on it, on what your interests are, or reflective in your practice and thinking about your training, it can be quite overwhelming. So that level of preparation and really carefully considering sort of the purpose of why you want to obtain a counseling psychology degree is absolutely important, quite vital for your success, particularly if you're looking to be quite successful in your career.
Okay, so I think great question, which I like, supervision, like how do you, Jessica, from your own experience, how do you handle your own mental health when you're constantly confronted with, so yes, can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, as I mentioned, there is a basic requirement for you to have at least 40 hours of personal therapy. And again, that is also instilled in order to ensure that our trainees, put forward their own self-care, their own mental health development whilst on a very rigorous training program. And as a practitioner, that's something that you always have to consider quite carefully, that you keep yourself, competent, that you keep yourself healthy and safe so that you're safe to practice with others. And that, essentially, if you're not fit to practice, you have to be able to kind of step away and reflect on that, but also get the support you need. And, for me, it's really about using several resources to really support my personal development as well as my professional development through the utilization of supervision, personal therapy, self-care. I run extensively. I mean, that's like running is my therapy, and really just kind of trying to focus on sort of self-care as an active resistance, particularly if you're always trying to support others and really trying to elevate society, that it's the utmost important kind of value that you have is to maintain your own well-being and your own welfare in order to better support others.
Yeah, and I think
great question.
In each placement, it's not that they just give you cases and there's like handle it and then leave you alone, but there's like supervision and you talk about it and you share it and you discuss it and to kind of help you handle this. It's not that they neither the counseling program nor the placements you work in or your volunteer experience leaves you alone with these.
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, and I like to kind of muse that, it takes a village to raise a counseling psychologist, honestly. Like, we work in relation with others. We expect our clients to work in relation with us, but the same should be expected of us in our profession, is to work with others as well.
Okay, I would just you suggest Thank you so much. That was amazing. Really enjoyed it. I could listen to you all day. I think you probably have tons of experience in doing these things, and like not doing anything. Tons of really, really interesting experience from moving around the world, working in counseling psychology. So I feel like, oh, I could ask you so many questions. I think if it's fine with you, we hang around a little bit longer, see what the questions are. I would just love to kind of stop the recording, because I think sometimes students feel like, oh my God, it's 1.5 hours.
I should actually plug one of my papers that was published, that I collaborated with I think 8 other countries across the globe. And so essentially we looked at the identity of counseling psychologists across the world, and we just kind of highlighted our similarities and differences in this paper, which is really interesting. So if you get a chance, I'll put it up and maybe
yes,
as a
share that with your slides.
Mm-hmm.
And then I can share it with the students. Yes. Okay,
Definitely.
fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.